All right, hello everyone. We have just finished Unit 1. You probably just finished your exam, and we are now moving on to Unit 2. Unit 2 is the skeletal system. So we will be learning about lots of different types of bones and labeling many throughout your body. However, we start with just kind of looking at the function of the system, the four main types of bones in your body, and what they're composed of. So in this system, we're going to be looking at mostly bones and cartilage, and they are in charge of supporting your body, facilitating the movement of your body, working closely with muscles, and protecting a lot of your internal organs as well. Let's see. So even though bones look like they are non-living, they are actually very much so alive or full of living cells and tissues. They do have some non-living material in them, but also many very active cells and tissues. Some of the tissues we'll be looking at in bones are cartilage, which is a flexible tissue that is in a lot of infants, but then as they get older and grow, it's usually replaced by bone. Although, as we know, like when you get your cartilage pierced, there is still some areas in our body with cartilage. We'll also be looking at connective tissue in the bones, including blood vessels, and we'll also be looking at nervous tissue in the bones as well, which is often a surprise to know that that's flowing through the air. So we're going to start off with four major types of bones. And these are very different in primarily their size and shape. And although these characteristics are different, they do have similar functions, structures, and ways in which they develop. So we're going to start off with long bones, which is type number 1. I like to think long limbs. So when you think of your limbs, that's where your long bones really are. Limbs. So long bones, as the name describes, have long longitudinal axes. And at the end, they have expanded ends or portions. So I'll draw a picture for you in just a second, but before I do that, here's an example of where you can find them. In your forearm, you'll find your ulna, for example. In your thigh, you'll find your femur, for example, although there are many other places where you can find long bones too. So so here's my arm, right? And so if I am in anatomical position with my thumb to the side, my ulna is going to be the long bone right through here, all the way extending up to my elbow. So let's draw a picture of a long bone, just a little sketch. Kind of looks like what you picture like a dog bone. Just really long with each end kind of extending outward or expanding at the end. Then I'm just going to draw a picture, which you're welcome to draw as well, with a person's arm. I'm going to add a little elbow in and then just circle right here. I'm showing that's where the ulna is. And then I'm also going to draw the leg with the knee and a circle showing where the femur is as well. Okay, so number 2 is short bones. And these are cube-like bones. Their length is about equal to their width. So that's the short bones, very different from long bones. Luckily, the names kind of explain exactly what they are. An example would be the wrists and ankles, the carpals and tarsals, which is like the scientific name for the wrists and ankles. So we'll write those in parentheses. Different parts of your hands, so different portions, we'll learn the scientific names for these later, of your fingers and your palm, the bones there, and then specifically your wrist right here is a nice cube-like structure as well. So I'm just going to draw a picture of the hand and the wrist and circle the wrist there, carpals. Okay, bone type number 3 is flat bones. So, flat bones are plate-like. They have a broad surface. And some examples would be the ribs, the sternum, which is the bone that goes kind of right between the ribs, right in the center of either side of your ribs, the left and the right ribs, the skull, and the scapulae. Or singular will be scapula, which is if like you raise your hand and you put the other hand on the back of your shoulder, you'll feel the scapula kind of popping out, these triangular bones. They kind of look like this shape, which I'll draw underneath. The skull, as we know, has a nice flat surface. The sternum has this shape, and the sternum is right between all of your ribs, which there's obviously a lot more than just 2 of, in the front of your body. The last type is irregular bones, and oddly enough, the way we categorize irregular bones is just anything that doesn't fit into the other categories. So these are any shape other than above. Okay, some examples would be the vertebrae and the mandible, which is like the jaw, again, amongst many others in the body. So I'm just going to draw a vertebrae as an example. It has these processes, 3 of them that stick out like that, and a hole for the spinal cord right up near them. Very irregular shape there. Okay. And then the last thing we're going to do in this lecture is we are going to look at a picture of a long bone and label it. So we'll eventually get to look at a real long bone, which we'll get from Podestos. It'll be nice and large, usually a femur from a cow. But for now, we have a nice little kind of picture of it. So what I want you to do is make sure you have a good chunk of space. Otherwise, you can just flip right to the back and glue this picture right in the bottom corner of your paper. And as soon as you have it glued down, just label it long bones. You remember, yes, this is not representing all the bones above, but the long bone is the easiest to kind of see all the parts, so we focus on that one here. Long bone. I'm going to use colors. You don't need to use colors, but I just think it helps a little bit. So I'm just going to start with number 1 and move down. And as I go through each, I will also write a definition for them too. Oops, sorry. Okay, so we'll start with number 1. Number 1 is pointing to a type of bone in this bone. So I'm going to circle number 1 in this purple color. So if you're using color, you can do that as well. And then I'm going to just write a number 1 to the side and label this the spongy bone. Now it's a little hard to tell from this image, but if you were looking up nice and close to this, you could see that this spongy bone is very porous. It kind of looks like a sponge. Something you want to be careful about is although spongy bone looks like a sponge, it's not soft and squishy like a sponge. It's very much so hard. So we can write that down. Spongy bone is porous bone tissue. It kind of looks mesh-like. And another word you'll hear to describe this porous texture, this holy texture, is cancellous. I'm just going to write in parentheses, not soft. It is very much so hard like a bone. Next we'll go down to number 2. So number 2 over here is showing a section. All this space in this section is space that's occupied by red marrow. If this was in color, you would see some spongy bone, and then in between it you'd see all this dark red coloring because it's filled with this red marrow. So space occupied by red marrow. And for now, we'll just leave it at that. We'll come back to talking about this in more depth. I guess we could write a little bit next to it. Red marrow is what makes red blood cells. So we'll add that in. Makes red blood cells. Oops. All right, number 3 is compact bone. So this is basically the opposite of spongy bone. Instead of being porous and mesh-like, it's very dense and thick. So we'll go over here, we'll circle number 3, and we'll write compact bone. Okay, and like I said, this is dense, thick, and heavy, and strong. And that's why it takes up pretty much this entire space here, which is, we'll label this in a second, it's called the diaphysis. So it's nice and strong. You think about where this is in our femur, that huge portion of our body that supports a ton of weight. It has to be nice and strong. It has to be something that doesn't break very easily. So we'll write diaphysis here. And I guess up near the red marrow, we could write epiphysis too. You'll see what these are in just a second. Okay, moving on. Number 4, we have something called the medullary cavity. So I'm going to label this in red. So there's number 4. Moving over here. The medullary cavity. Now you see the word cavity, and really what this is just an empty space. Like it's something that holds something else. That's what it means for cavity. So it's just the hollow chamber in the diaphysis of a long bone. And we'll leave it at that. Number 5 is called the yellow marrow. So we saw red marrow before up here, which makes red blood cells. This is our yellow marrow. And yellow marrow, we see this in a lot of pictures that fat's kind of signified by like a yellow or orange color. Yellow marrow is what stores fat. So we do have some fat storage in our bones. After that, we have number 6, which is called the periosteum. You can see how in the picture over here it's kind of peeled back. This is just a layer that surrounds the entire diaphysis of the bone. So we will write that it covers the entire bone. It's like our skin covering our entire body, just covers the entire bone except the articular, cartilage. And we'll label that in just a minute too. Okay, so it's pressed to the bone and continuous with the ligaments and tendons. A nice kind of skin-like layer covering the entirety of the bone. Number 7. Heading back up to the top. Number 7, these are called epiphyseal discs. So they're in the epiphysis, which we probably should have labeled first, but that's okay. epiphyseal discs. And they're just those little line-like looking things kind of near the top. Now, the epiphyseal discs is where the bone grows from. So we could just say the growth plate type thing. So this is where the bone grows from. We'll say growth plates of bone. Number 8 is now a section of the bone. So this is what I've referred to quite a bit in here. And it's this entire top portion of the bone. We also see it down here in number 10. You can notice that the structure is slightly different from number 8 to number 10. And so we're going to label number 8 the proximal epiphysis. I'm going to flip to the back for this one. The proximal epiphysis. And then we'll label number 10. I'm going to use the same color and circle it too. This is the distal epiphysis. So number 10 down here, the distal epiphysis. As we know, proximal means closer to our body, distal means further from our body, or further from the trunk, I should say. And so that's what this is referring to. If you have a side of a bone closer, like let's say I have my ulna and I'm closer to my elbow, right up here, that would be my proximal epiphysis side of the bone, versus the distal side would be closer to my wrist. So distal epiphysis. And you'll hear epiphyses, that means the plural of these, but basically both of these are the end of a long bone, that expanded end of a long bone. And this is where the joint is formed. With another bone. And finally, we have number 9, the diaphysis. Oops. Number 9. Okay, so this is where the compact bone is. Remember on the other side, I labeled the epiphyses for red bone marrow, for spongy bone. That's where both of those are found. And the diaphysis is where we have that medullary cavity holding all of that yellow marrow, as well as mostly compact bone here. So we call this like the shaft of the bone. Between the epiphyses. Okay, again, this is where the medullary cavity would be, the yellow marrow, all of that. So you can take a look at the picture as a whole. Because we use numbers, it's nice you can kind of practice it without looking at the label there and quiz yourself. I would like you to come in tomorrow knowing how to label this and knowing where each part is, as well as some kind of fact about it, like what it holds, what its texture is, etc. So make sure that in addition to doing this lecture, you practice with this lecture tonight. You know examples, you're able to label this and really confident in this structure, because tomorrow we're going to cut one in half, cut a little cross section of a bone out, and look really closely at the microstructure, which gets a lot more complex. So you want to make sure you have these down before we go any further. But that is the start of Unit 2, the skeletal system.